Part 1, Chapter 5, Endgame Strategy. We must now revert once more to the endings. Their importance will have become evident to the student who has taken the trouble to study my game with Janowski in example 53. After an uneventful opening, a Roy Lopez, and one of its normal variations, my opponent suddenly made things interesting by offering the exchange, an offer which, of course, I accepted. Then followed a very hard, arduous struggle in which I had to defend myself against a very dangerous attack made possible by the excellent maneuvering of my adversary. Finally, there came the time when I could give back the material and change off most of the pieces and come to an ending in which I clearly had the advantage. But yet the ending itself was not as simple as it first appeared, and finally, perhaps through one weak move on my part, became a very difficult matter to find a win. Had I been a weak endgame player, the game probably would have ended in a draw, and all my previous efforts would have been in vain. Unfortunately, that is very often the case among the large majority of players. They are weak in the endings, a failing from which masters of the first rank are at times not free. Incidentally, I might call attention to the fact that all the world's champions of the last 60 years have been exceedingly strong in the endings. Morphy, Steinitz, and Dr. Lasker had no superiors in this department of the game while they held their titles. Section 26. The Sudden Attack from a Different Side. I have previously stated, when speaking about general theory, that at times the way to win consists in attacking first on one side, then, granted greater mobility of the pieces, to transfer the attack quickly from one side to the other, breaking through before your opponent has been able to bring up sufficient forces to withstand the attack. This principle of the middle game can sometimes be applied in the endings in somewhat similar manner. Example 56. In the above position, I, with the black pieces, played Rook e4 check, Rook e2, Rook a4, Rook a2, h5. The idea, as will be seen very soon, is to play h5 to h4 in order to fix white's kingside pawns with a view to the future. It is evident to black that white wants to bring his king to b3 to support his two weak isolated pawns and thus to free his rooks. Black therefore makes a plan to shift the attack to the king side at the proper time in order to obtain some advantage from the greater mobility of his rooks. Rook d1, Rook d, a5, in order to force the rook to rook square, keeping both rooks tied up. Rook d, a1, h4, King d2, King g7, King c2, Rook g5. Black begins to transfer his attack to the king side. Rook g1. A serious mistake which loses quickly. White should have played King b3 when black would have answered Rook a5, f3, and black would have obtained an opening at g3 for his king, which in the end might give him the victory. Rook f4. Now the king cannot go to b3, King b3, because of Rook b5 check. King d3, Rook f3 check, King e2. If g takes f3, then Rook takes g1, followed by Rook b1, winning. Rook takes h3, and black won after a few moves. Example 57. Another good example in which is shown the advantage of the greater mobility of the pieces in an ending is the following from a game Capablanca vs. Kupchik played at the Havana Masters Tournament, 1913. The full score and notes of the game can be found in the book of the tournament. White's only advantage in the above position is that he possesses the open file and has the move, which will secure him the initiative. There is also the slight advantage of having his pawns on the queen side united, while black has an isolated a pawn. The proper course, as in the previous ending, is to bring the rooks forward, so that at least one of them may be able to shift from one side of the board to the other, and thus keep black's rooks from moving freely. What this means in general theory has been stated already. It really means keep harassing the enemy. Force him to use his big pieces to defend pawns. If he has a weak point, try to make it weaker, or create another weakness somewhere else, and his position will collapse sooner or later. If he has a weakness and he can get rid of it, make sure that you create another weakness somewhere else. From the position in question, the game continued thus: Rook e4, Rook f e8, with the object of repeating white's maneuver and also not to allow white the control of the open file. Rook a e1, Rook e6, Rook 1 e3, Rook c e8, King f1, King f8. Black wants to bring his king to the center of the board in order to be nearer to whatever point white decides to attack. The move is justified, at least on the general rule, that in such endings the king should be in the middle of the board. He does nothing, after all, but follow white's footsteps. Besides, it is hard to point out anything better. If d5, then rook g4 check, followed by king e2, would leave black in a very disagreeable position. If f5, then rook d4, great move. Rook takes e3, mistake. F takes e3. Rook takes e3. King f2. Rook e7. Rook a4. Winning the a pawn, which would practically leave white with a passed pawn ahead on the queen side, as the 3 pawns of black on the king side would be held by the 2 of white. King e2, King e7, Rook a4, Rook a8. The student should note that through the same maneuver, black is forced into a position similar to the one shown in the previous ending. Rook a5, great move. This move has a manifold object. It practically fixes all of black's pawns except the d pawn, which is the only one that can advance 2 squares. It specially prevents the advance of black's f pawns, and at the same time threatens the advance of white's f pawns to f4 and f5. By this threat, it practically forces black to play d5, which is all white desires, for reasons that will soon become evident. d5, c4, great move, king d6. Evidently forced, as the only other move to save a pawn would have been d takes c4, which would have left all black's pawns isolated and weak. If d4, then rook e4, king d6, b4, great move, rook e5, rook a6, and black's game is hopeless. c5 check, king d7, d4, f5. Apparently very strong, since it forces the exchange of rooks because of the threat rook h6, but in reality it leads to nothing. The best chance was to play rook g8, rook takes e6, f takes e6, f4. Up to now, white had played with finesse, but this last move is weak. Rook a6 was the proper way to continue, so as to force black to give up his a pawn or c pawn. King c8, king d2. Again, a bad move. Rook a3 was the proper continuation, and if then rook b8, then b3, king b7, b4, king a8, rook b3, with excellent winning chances. In fact, I believe a one game. King b7. Black misses his only chance. Rook b8 would have drawn. Rook a3. Rook g8. Rook h3. Rook g7. King e2. King a6. Rook h6. Rook e7. King d3. King b7. He goes back with the king to support his e-pawn, and thus be able to utilize his rook. It is, however, useless, and only white's peak play later on gives him further chances of a draw. h4, king c8, rook h5, to prevent the black rook from controlling the open file. King d7, rook g5, rook f7, king c3, king c8. He must keep his king on that side because white threatens to march with his king to a6 via b4. King b4, rook f6, king a5, king b7, a4, a6, h5, rook h6. He can do nothing but wait for white. The text move stops white from moving his rook, but only for one move. b4, rook f6. The only other move was king a7 when white could play rook g7 or even b5. b5. A weak move, which gives black a fighting chance. In this ending, as is often the case with most players, white plays the best moves whenever the situation is difficult and requires careful handling, but once his position seems to be overwhelming, he relaxes his efforts and the result is nothing to be proud of. The right move was rook g7. A takes b5, a takes b5, rook f8, great move, rook g7, rook a8, check, king b4, c takes b5, king takes b5, rook a2, c6 check, king b8, rook takes h7, rook b2 check, king a5, rook a2 check, king b4, rook takes f2. Black misses his last chance, rook b2 check, forcing the king to c3 in order to avoid the perpetual would probably draw. The reader must bear in mind that my opponent was then a very young and inexperienced player, and consequently deserves a great deal of credit for the fight he put up. Rook e7, rook takes f4. Rook b2 check followed by rook h2 offered better chances. h6, great move. Rook takes d4 check. King b5. Rook d1. h7. Rook b1 check. King c5. Rook c1 check. King d4. Rook d1 check. King e5. Rook e1 check. King f6. Rook h1. Rook e8 check. King a7. h8 equals queen. Rook takes h8. Rook takes h8. King b6. King takes e6. King takes c6. King takes f5. King c5. King e5. Resigns. This ending shows how easy it is to make weak moves, and how often, even in master play, mistakes are made and opportunities are lost. It shows that, so long as there is no great advantage of material, even with a good position, a player, no matter how strong, cannot afford to relax his attention even for one move.